All right, guys, this is my 2025-2026 NHL playoff prediction review video. I did a video at the beginning of the year predicting the 8 teams I thought would make it from the East and 8 teams I thought would make it from the West for the NHL playoffs this year for 2025-2026. So let's get into it. I went 5-3 in the East, and I went 6-2 in the West for my predictions for the NHL, for the teams I thought would make the playoffs for the NHL this year out of the East and West. For an overall record of 11-5 out of 16 picks, so not too bad there. So out of the East, let's get into it. Out of the East, these are the teams I had making it out of the East. These are the 8 teams I had making it out of the East this year. I had it being the Bruins, the Red Wings, the Canadiens, the Panthers, the Lightning. And then I had the Maple Leafs, the Hurricanes, and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Them are the 8 teams I had making the playoffs for the Eastern Conference. Out of them 8 teams I just said, the only 3 teams that didn't make it were the Red Wings, the Maple Leafs, and the Panthers. So yeah, the 3 that didn't make it that I had making it, the three that didn't make it that I had making it out of the East were the Florida Panthers. The 3 that didn't make it that I had making it out of the East were the 3 that didn't make it that I had making it out of the East were the 2-time defending Stanley Cup champion, the Florida Panthers, the Detroit Red Wings, and the Toronto Maple Leafs. The 3 that made it in over them 3 were the Buffalo Sabres, the Philadelphia Flyers. The 3 that made it in over the 3 I had making that didn't make it in, the 3 that made it in out of the East that I didn't have making it in were the Buffalo Sabres, the Philadelphia Flyers, and the Ottawa Senators. So now we move to the West. So these are the 8 teams I had making the NHL playoffs from the West. Avalanche. These are the 8 teams I had making it to the NHL playoffs from the West. And we're going to start with that. We had the Avalanche. We had the Avalanche, Stars, Jets. Then we had the Wild, the Ducks, and the Kings. And then we had the Oilers and the Blackhawks. Obviously, out of them 8 teams I just mentioned out of the West, the only 2 that didn't make it out of them, the only 2 that didn't make it out of the 8 teams that I just mentioned for the West for the NHL playoffs were the Winnipeg Jets and my Chicago Blackhawks. Obviously, I knew when I predicted the Blackhawks they weren't going to make it. I just figured they weren't really a playoff team, but I was biased. I was picking my team no matter what. So the 2 that made it in over the Jets and the Blackhawks. Now the 2 that made it in over the Jets and the Blackhawks were the Vegas Golden Knights and the Utah Mammoth, which is really cool there. I think it's really cool that the Utah Mammoth made the playoffs since last year was their inaugural season. To make the playoffs this year is pretty cool. If I had a sentimental favorite to win the Stanley Cup champion this year, to win the Stanley Cup championship, it would be them. I'm actually rooting for the Edmonton Oilers because they've been there in back-to-back years now and they've lost in heartbreaking fashion. Lost in 7 games a couple years ago, and then they lost it again last year. Both to the Florida Panthers, which really sucks for them, but yeah, I'd like to see them get it done. But anyways, to recap, 5-3 in the East. To recap my NHL playoff prediction review video, I went 5-3 in the East. I went to recap my NHL playoff prediction review video for the 8 teams out of the East and 8 teams out of the West that I thought would make the playoffs this year for the NHL to recap my NHL playoff prediction video for the 8 teams I thought would make it out of the East and 8 teams I thought would make it out of the West. I went 5-3 in the East. I went 5-3 in the East. I went 5-3 in the East, 6-2 in the West, which surprised me because I usually do better in the other conference. So 5-3 in the East, 6-2 in the West, for a total of so 5-3 in the East, 6-2 in the West, for a total of 11-5 overall between the 16 teams. So there you go. Obviously, the teams are all set right now. The 16 teams, the 8 teams out of the East and the 8 teams out of the West are set. Nothing will change. These will be the eight teams that made the playoffs for the East and the 8 teams that made the playoffs for the West are set. The seeding is not set for the West, but the seeding is set for the seeding is so. The 16 teams the 16 teams that made this year's NHL playoffs are set. The 8 from the East, the 8 from the West are set. The seeding and matchups are set for the East, but not the West. So as soon as the West is set, I will be back with my first round playoff predictions. But anyways, you guys all enjoy your day. Like I said, 5-3 in the East, 6-2 in the West, 11-5 overall between the Eastern and Western Conference for the NHL playoffs. Anyways, it's always go Blackhawks.